Okay, so I'll do a very, very quick round of introductions. Suffice it to say that everybody on the stage is my friend, which is the best introduction. Paro is a well-known children's author. Many of you in the audience would have read her book. She's severally translated. She works also with literature in action, and she works with literature and children. Anushka is literally the spokesperson for this panel, where if she just stood by herself, it was enough, because she is actually writing as a child, and she's going to tell us all about it. And she's a published author at the age of 11, so I think that deserves a round of applause. Then I have Rohini, who's a literary translator as well as author of children's books, both fiction and non-fiction. And in the course of the conversation, we'll learn more about her work, both as a translator and as a writer. And to my right is Maja, who's come all the way from Norway and who has a very successful book under her belt. It has sold 250,000 copies, I'm told, over Christmas, and it has the most gorgeous illustrations, which I was fortunate to see. Is it available at the bookshop? Yes, yes, okay. So you can possibly take a look at that. It's a Christmas story, and she writes for both adults and children, and we will sort of get a perspective from her, which is going to show us the commonalities between Norway and India when it comes to writing for children. Okay, so you know, this panel is again worded in such a way that the topic is worded in such a way that you could interpret it whichever way you like. So when you say writing for children, writing as children, what do we really mean? So I will start off by telling you that I am involved with children's publishing because I believe that children's literature is a very important part of a holistic education. And in our country, we have to understand the relationships between publishing and education, and also the politics of how certain languages dominate publishing and certain languages get edged out. And when that happens, what happens to the literatures in those languages? What happens to the children who are coming to school to be educated and yet do not have access to the literatures in their own languages? For me, those are important questions. I have been a multilingual children's publisher for the longest time, and I believe that publishing for children in all Indian languages is equally important. So from that perspective, when we are talking about writing for children and writing as children, what are the assumptions that we are basing this statement on? Who are the children are we assuming are the children who are writing or whom we are writing for? What languages do they read? What happens to the idiom of stories? It's like, if I grew up listening to my first stories in my mother tongue, I actually learned the grammar of understanding a story through that language and those images and that kind of imagery. And when I chose then to write in a language which is not my mother tongue, what happened to that? What happened to the grammar that grew inside me? How did it shift? And how did I adopt a new language? So for me, those questions as a publisher are important. So against that backdrop, I will invite each of my panelists to tell me their interpretation of writing for children, writing as children. Paro has chosen that extreme seat because she says she hears better over there. So I'm sure she'll talk better as well. So I'm going to first ask her, as a published children's author who's chosen to write on difficult subjects, who's often taken on the voice of the young adult to express difficult truths. What is it that you really do to write as a child, especially when you were a child a long time ago, but you're writing for today's child? So how do you sort of traverse that line of writing as a child today, when your experience of childhood was quite far away and quite different?
Thank you, Manisha. And I think I was really puzzled a bit by the topic, because for me, I don't segregate it. It doesn't matter that I'm 60 today, because when I'm writing a child's story, then I inhabit that skin. I walk in those shoes. I become that person. So I am that child. I don't think of myself as a 60-year-old writing as a 13-year-old or whatever. I just am. And so I was kind of a bit flummoxed as to what I would add to that basic premise. I need to be that person, whoever that person is, whoever my protagonist is. And if I can't find myself in that skin, then I can't write that character. And it has happened that in the skin of a particular character, I have a story where a young girl, a teenager, is raped by her uncle. And it's told from the points of view of many people. Now, this is a story for teenagers and young adults. In my book, The Other, it's told from the points of view of the mother, the father, the girl herself, her teacher, her best friend, a boy who really likes her, and the grandmother. And when I was writing the grandmother's point of view, I was struggling to be the grandmother because she is questioning, what did I do to raise a man who raped? Where was my fault that I brought up a rapist? And she actually takes permission from her granddaughter to go and see her son who's in jail. I did put him in jail. But when she's standing outside the prison, and I'm inhabiting the grandmother at that moment, not a child, but I couldn't go in. I couldn't find the courage to take the steps to go in and confront this uncle, her son, and find out why he did what he did. So I think for me, writing for a child is writing as a child as well.
So do you think that your interaction with young people on a regular basis in literature and action, how does that sort of work with your imaginative skills? I mean, how much do you draw upon your interactions?
A lot. I mean, I couldn't be a writer if I didn't work with young people as well. Through literature and action, I've worked with about over 3 lakh children. In English terms, what is 3 lakh? 300,000. So over 300,000 young people. And so it really informs my writing. It informs my language. I think the biggest compliment I've ever got is I published a story in a newspaper, and a letter from a reader came back saying, "Thank goodness you finally got teenagers to write for teenagers." And that's the best compliment I've ever got. You know, that I wasn't auntie trying to be really hip. It just sounded as though I was really hip, which I'm not.
Okay, so Anushka, I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit about how you became this first-time author. Why did you choose to write poetry first, and what are you working on now?
So, since when I was really young, my parents used to read a lot of stories to me, bedtime stories, and I used to love them. And the stories that I really liked, I used to remember them by heart. So that's when it first, like, that spark got ignited that, okay, reading is something that's really my thing. I love to read. And then slowly I wrote my first story. And I used to make up stories. So I wrote my first story at the age of 5. It was a really short story. So my mother thought that, okay, writing a story at the age of 5, that's something interesting. So she made a blog for me, and I used to post, with my parents' help, I used to post my stories on that blog so that other people could read it. And then one day I wrote my first poem, and everybody was like, okay, poems, that's cool. So when I wrote my first poem, by the look of it, I thought that, okay, writing poems seems easier and it seems more fun. So then I started writing poems and stories and I posted them on my blog. Then one day, it was New Year and all of us were sitting together discussing resolutions. So I got out a list of 20 resolutions for that particular year, and one of them was write a poem every month. So my goal at the end of the year was to have 12 poems in my hand. I started writing and I liked it. I really enjoyed. So instead of 12, I wrote every week and I ended up with 52 poems at the end of the year.
She really makes it sound so easy, doesn't she?
It was quite easy actually, because I liked it, I liked reading, and my love for writing developed that way.
So what did you like to read?
Well, when I was really young, I used to read simple English books like Dr. C.S. and Geronimo Stilton. And then gradually I started reading Roald Dahl and then Enid Blyton. And then by the time I was 9, 10, I read the Harry Potter series. And nowadays I read a lot of Stephanie Meyer and John Green and Veronica Roth. So my reading has also developed, has grown as I have grown.
Wonderful. So we'll hear more about your writing. You can possibly show everybody your book. This is Anushka's first book.
This is the book that I got published, Once Upon a Verse, because poems tell stories. This is the compilation of the 52 poems that I had written.
Wow. So Anushka is really an inspiration to all of us who ever dream of writing and we don't do anything about it. Anushka just goes out and makes a New Year resolution and actually sticks to it and comes up with a 52 poem book. So I'll just move on from Anushka to Rohini, who wears two hats of being a children's author as well as a literary translator. And she says that she came into children's writing after translation. Or was it the other way around? Okay. So what is it that drew you into translation, and then you also thought of writing for children, and what are the two languages and how do you play between them?
Well, to answer the simple question first, my two primary languages are Hindi and English. Hindi is my mother tongue. Closer? Better? Yeah. Okay, so my two languages are Hindi and English. Hindi is my mother tongue. It is the language in which I first heard stories from my grandmother, from my aunts. I had a childhood where I didn't read stories, I heard them. And I think the experience of hearing stories is very different from being read stories. And I see that today when I read stories to my grandchildren or try to tell them stories and they say, no, we want it read. So it's a completely different experience. So as Manisha said, the grammar of stories, the structure of stories for me was heard, and it was in Hindi. And then actually I didn't imagine that I would become a writer or a translator one day. I kind of fell into both professions or both vocations. The writing came about when my children were born, when my daughter was born. So it's all terribly personal for me, what I write, why I write. And it began with my wanting to tell her stories in Hindi. Now I had the stories I had in my repertoire, and I found that she needed more. So I began to write, and I wrote for her in Hindi. So my very first writing for children was all in Hindi. And as my children grew, their demand for stories grew. When my second daughter was born, she wanted a different animal story every night. And after a while, my inventiveness ran out. So I said, okay, the Panchatantra, that exists, so let's go to that. And then I found that the stories that were available were very inadequate. from the Panchatantra. There was no complete Panchatantra that I could access in either Hindi or English that was well written for me to read to my children. So I said, well, why shouldn't I do it? And that was my step into translation. And well, that project took a long time. It took 20 years for that book to be done, and it was only published last year by Puffin. It began so long ago, so that was a very long journey. But the main thing, the point I'm trying to make here is this interplay of languages, the two languages I work with. For me, Hindi is the emotional language. When I write something that's intense, that's to do with feeling, I think in Hindi. I sometimes write in Hindi, but I definitely think in Hindi and then put it into English. When it is to do with the mind, when it's something intellectual, then I go to English, because that's been my experience. I was educated in an English medium school, so everything of the mind is in English. So when I explain things to my daughters or to any child, the language I naturally follow is English. So when I write non-fiction, I don't even think in Hindi. I think in English, and I do my research in English, and I write in English, and there is no conflict. But when I am writing fiction for children, that's when this whole hinterland of folk stories, my childhood, the tales I heard, the structure of stories in Hindi and the language itself comes into play.
That's really interesting. And in a country where there are 780 plus languages which have stories and which have speakers, isn't it a pity that we are confined to few dominant languages for the characterizations and the representations of childhood that we are able to access? So I think really as publishers or as people in education, it's a very serious matter if we just let a huge part of our heritage simply lapse into a space of silence simply because it doesn't come out into the open, and those ways of seeing things or ways of telling those tales are lost to us. I think that is really important for us as children's publishers particularly. So I'll turn to Maja and ask her about what is it in Norway that is so wonderful that it produces all these wonderful authors and illustrators. What is it in the system that is that sort of encourages the fertility that we see in Norwegian children's books in particular? And then talk about your journey as a writer.
Well, the first question, we have a very good funding system in Norway. So we have all books, most books published are bought by all the libraries. So you're sort of guaranteed at least 1,000 books sold of every book's published. And that, of course, make it easier for the publishers to actually take a chance and making the books and even making the smaller sort of not very commercial titles come true. And also we have for getting our books out in the world, we have a lot of support for translations. So a lot of my books, for example, the translations are actually supported by an organization called NOLA, who is also here now. I think NOLA is definitely part of my international success as an author because they have supported so many translations. And also I think they are very much a part of the success of a lot of Norwegian authors because our books do travel a lot. We are a small country, only a couple of million people, but still we have a lot of books traveling the world.
Yes, I heard that your recent very successful book has already sold in 20 languages.
Yes,
So
22 now, I think.
that
yes,
is quite something.
yes, and it happened in only a few months, so it's really good.
Tell us a
yes.
little bit about that book, because I'm told it was a sort of a roaring success literally overnight, and I understand that it talks about loss and grief.
Yes.
So as a children's author, how do you sort of think as a child, how do you think of presenting difficult subjects like loss and grief for children, and yet have a book which is so widely loved and appreciated?
It was actually the most sold book in Norway last year, which is, for me, thank you. I'm more happy for the book. I mean, that the children book actually was the most sold book in Norway. I just think that's amazing. It hasn't happened since Harry Potter. So, and I've always been writing children books, but they were sort of always a bit invisible compared to my books for adults. And suddenly this exploded, and it was such a big surprise. Because, as you say, it's a book about sorrow. And I remember calling my editor when I started to work on the theme. She knew I wanted to write a children's book about Christmas. And they were sort of very happy because they thought this might be a commercial success as well, because Christmas is very big in Norway. Norwegian people are crazy about Christmas. And then I started to get into the story, and I realized that the main character, who is a boy who is 10 years old, he had lost his sister, and it was actually a book about sorrow. And I called her and I told her, sorry, I don't think this will be the big commercial success you planned, because this will be quite sad and serious. So, but and I can't explain the success, but it's about a family who has lost their oldest daughter, and it's about a boy trying to connect to his family again, and this family connecting to each other, and they are all sort of they're like copies of themselves. He says that actually. He says, they are not my parents anymore, they're just copies. I don't know who they are. They try to be like my parents used to be, but they're just copies. And then he meets a girl who is sort of a firework, and she helps him overcome his sorrow, and he also helps him connect to his family again, and in the end actually visit the grave of the sister, because they haven't dared going there yet. And I think what happened with this book is that people related so much to the story, and I still get a lot of messages from people telling me that I lost someone. And this has enabled me to talk to my children about it. I lost my sister when I was young, for example, or we lost a daughter 2 years ago, and now we can suddenly talk about it in another way. And in a lot of classrooms, they are actually able to talk to the children about this in a completely different way than earlier. So it sort of opened up something. And also what was really special about it was that it has 24 chapters. So people actually read it they read one chapter every day. And people read it at the same time all over Norway. So, and they were going crazy on Instagram. And it was just, I don't think I will ever experience something like emotionally strong as this with a book again.
That sounds really brilliant, and I think also reiterates for all of us that a good children's book is never just a children's book, it's just a great book. It's a book that we all relate to, and we will always relate to. And it's unfair to merely relegate it into the category of a children's book.
And that's, as you said earlier as well, for me it's not about writing for children, it is writing as a child and being that child. And this book grown-ups read it for themselves. Now old couples were reading to each other, reading out loud one chapter each day. And it was sort of, for me, a good book is not about the target group. It's about the story. And if, like, this is a book where the story, the person who tells the story is 10 years old, and then children can relate to it and identify, but you can read it at every age. It doesn't have, I mean, it's for everyone.
It's for everyone. Yeah.
Manisha, if I could just jump in here one moment. I think this is a really important thing that Maja has spoken about, the tremendous power that children's stories have to talk about very difficult issues. I mean, children or other people stepping up and talking about a difficult loss for the very first time, triggered by that story, because stories are this safe space where you can talk about really difficult issues. And I know that in India at least, sometimes there's a lot of fear about it, and you don't, you feel, you know, children are too young. I'm often asked, why do I write these stories for children? Shouldn't children's stories be just happy, fun, magic, and not the kind of serious issues that I deal with? But I think it's because they are children and there are things that they're already talking about. They're in fact already talking about. It's just that we don't hear them. But through stories, you can open that window.
No, and isn't it the business of stories actually to raise emotionally intelligent adults? I mean, I think somewhere children's literature is that window which allows you to talk about difficult things, because all of us have difficult emotions. And whether it's through, I think on the earlier panel somebody was talking about magic realism. Yes. There's so much fantasy in children's literature. It's not just to tick a box in a genre, it is because fantasy gives you the psychological resources to face difficult times. And it is when you imagine unimaginable things is when you come up with you know, reasons to continue to live. But as authors, all of you, do you think about your readers when you're writing, or are you just writing? And I'm going to first ask Anoushka to answer that.
When I was writing my first few stories and poems, I used to write them for myself. It used to be like when there's nothing to do, when you just want pleasure, you write for yourself. So I used to write poems and little stories for myself. But then as I continued writing, I started thinking about other children of my age, or maybe younger than me, who would like to read certain genres. So I write about topics that I find interesting, because if I want children of my age or maybe younger than me, if I want them to read it, then they'll surely find it interesting as well.
So Rohini, what do you think that, you know, the stories that you referred to, which you heard as a child, which first exposed you to the pleasure of a story, you know, the very grammar that allows all human beings to enjoy a story is ingrained in us, somewhere in our DNA, and we all respond to stories very early on. So when you heard them in your own language, and then when you chose to write in English, did you think it influenced your understanding of the structure of a story, the fact that you'd heard oral stories first? Did you have that aspect in mind? Would they tell well? Did it have an impact?
I don't think it was very conscious or something that I focused on or analyzed. Thank you. But when I think back on my writing, or how especially when I'm translating, definitely that has played a role. And somewhere it informs my writing, absolutely. The way I heard stories and then the way I tell them. There's a definite influence. And the current translation that I'm working on is Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas. And for those in the audience who don't know it, it is a medieval retelling of the India's great epic, the Ramayana, in the spoken language of the times, in pre-modern Hindi. So I'm putting that into English. And that is a very interesting experience because I first heard this story as a very young child. And in fact, most children growing up in India will know this story. And now I'm putting it into a language which very often does not allow for certain ideas, emotions, concepts. And so that bridge is a difficult one to cross sometimes, and I have to pause and think. And it's in doing this that I really became aware of how I tell stories for children and the influence that listening to traditional stories has had on my writing as well. And if I may, I'd just like to add to what Paro said about difficult issues. In Hindi, there is really no such thing as children's literature. In fact, in most Indian languages that didn't exist. Even the stories that we say today are for children, like the Panchatantra, were really not for children. They were lessons in living for everybody. And I think stories, it's a very important role that traditional tales play. And they are sadly falling away. So for me, that's an important thing, to draw on those, to draw even on those issues. Even on something like the Ramayana, the human issues that a child will look at or think about, or you can put in front of a child in a relatively safe space. And they can learn of these things in the safety of their home with their mother, reading, and then when they confront it in the real world, it's not such a shock. So I firmly believe, like Paro, that as writers for children, we should not shirk from difficult issues.
Well, I mean, don't you think that in traditional Indian storytelling, there was not such a clear line dividing childhood and adulthood? Even if you look at Krishna's Bal Leela, he does all kinds of unacceptable things which in modern times some government school teacher might very well turn around and say that hum bachchon ko chori karna sikha rahe hain, because he would steal butter. I mean, it's really absurd how, you know, the current worry about protecting our children from every kind of difficult circumstance and just presenting a happy world, when increasingly our world is more and more complicated. You know, and the stories that we told our children earlier, they had really absurd and sometimes very violent situations. But because they were in the safe confines of a story, it was perfectly acceptable to look at that issue and also talk about it. So, Paro, would you have something to say about that, especially in the context of folk stories from our country?
Yeah, I mean, some of our folk stories are extremely bloody, extremely sexist, and there should be some censoring of those or rewriting, or, all right, if you're saying we don't want the censoring, then write it as it is, but in a way that you realize that, okay, this wasn't acceptable. You know, I mean, for a little boy to go and steal women's clothes while they're bathing would not be acceptable today, right? So we need to make those, we need to step carefully on those folk tales.
That's a very literal understanding of the whole thing. So
certainly,
we have to somewhere understand the difference between literalism.
But if you look at, let's say, the Panchatantra, the women are such negative characters, almost all of them. They are either shrews, bullies, you know, who are shouting at their husbands all the time and all that. These are not images that you want to perpetuate, right?
Correct. I mean, with respect to the Panchatantra and my translation, I actually took a conscious decision to leave out the very misogynistic stories. Yeah. That did not impact, fortunately, impact the structure of the whole work. But I, as a writer writing today, I could not permit those stories in my translation. They were appalling. And there were only, I think there were only 2 stories in that entire work of almost 100 stories where women are portrayed with anything like a positive role. And in both cases, they are mothers. So a woman as a woman on her own is dangerous. A woman as a wife is dangerous. It's only when she's a mother that she gets anything.
Unless you can find a way of putting a spin on it.
Spin on it, yes.
Someone did a play where the Panchtantra, you know, the three princes are regarded as idiotic and just stupid, and so therefore they have to be sent away to learn. So actually an NGO who works with multiply disabled children said that they were not idiots, they were special children, special need children, and so they needed special education. And that's how then they came to be. And I think that's such a great spin on an old story.
I'm not sure that's a spin, because I think it's there in the original actually. I think we spin and then we respin many times. And basically the Panchtantra, as I see it, for children is a different way of teaching, of learning, and through stories. And
I think somewhere we also have to touch upon the whole difference between bhasha and boli.
Yes.
Because when you were telling the stories in the bolis, in the oral traditions, there was always the scope to reinterpret.
Yes.
Which, when you print a book, when you put something down in writing, it's supposed to be recorded for posterity, whereas in every retelling, depending on the historical moment, I'm sure you can, you put a spin.
Yes,
you put
absolutely.
a spin which is acceptable regarding childhood today. Right?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So, I think we should also just ask Maja if there's something in the Nordic tradition which has traveled from, earlier times into modern times in a different way.
Well, I was thinking about it while you were talking now, and Norwegian folk tales and fairy tales are definitely for everyone. So in the earlier days, we didn't separate between children and adult stories either, and that is something I think is really interesting now that we have these different categories, which are, when you think about it, not always necessary. Luckily, we don't have, we have a lot of nice stories in a lot of our folk stories are nice and can still be told to both children and adults, but some of them are also, of course, very brutal and very sexist. But I think when it comes to seriousness and difficult issues, children can handle so much more than we think, and the old stories show us that. And also, like death, love, all the big questions are part of children's life as well as of ours. So there's no reason not to talk to children about these themes. And for me, of course, Astrid Lindgren, the Swedish writer, is the one and only when it comes to dealing with these themes in books that you can read both as a child and as an adult and get so much out of it.
Yeah, so actually Pippi, I think, has this universal appeal simply because it stands every patriarchal notion about a young girl on its head, quite literally and figuratively, where she just does completely crazy things and it's presented as normal and really interesting.
And for me, the Brother Lionheart, which I don't know if you read it, but it's about death, and it's done in such a fantastic, imaginative and subtle way that you just have to love it, but it's still really dark.
It's really dark. Mm-hmm. But then, this whole thing of patriarchy as the one huge stumbling block when we are talking about writing for children, not writing as children perhaps, but when you're writing for children, that is the one thing that is coming up as the one issue that you really have to work your way around in a manner where you can't really be a child, and you have to be somewhere a censoring adult, and you're shaping the material because you believe that that material is not suitable for children today. So, in that sense, we are making these choices based on our political beliefs today, where we also have notions about what is suitable and what is not. However much we would like to believe that we are writing as children, we are actually writing as thinking adults, and constantly making judgments about whether this is suitable for children or not. Anushka, do you think about would you censor yourself? Would you say, I will not write this because I think it's showing something which I don't agree with, even if your story demanded it? Since you're writing a novel now, I must
Yes.
say
When I'm writing, my thoughts are basically on the topic that I've chosen to write about. If it's a poem, the topic I want to write on is what I usually think of while writing, and other thoughts don't pop in my mind at the time. If they do, they're mostly very mild. I mean, I would like to say there's nothing that I feel is inappropriate to write. So whenever I'm writing, how should I phrase it? I don't get any weird thoughts. But well, I just don't like to write about boys liking girls or something like that.
You're 11, wait.
Okay.
I'd like to ask Anoushka a question, please, Manisha, if I may. Is there any book that you have read which you thought this wasn't really appropriate for children?
Not really. No.
Anything that your school may have thought, you're too young to be reading this?
Sometimes when I take some books to my library teacher and ask if I can read them, if I can issue them, they look at the book and they're like, if the book is fine according to them, they're like, okay, fine, you can take it home. But sometimes the books are not meant for me, so they say, you shouldn't be reading this right now, you're too young for it, so I have to keep that book back. And if the teacher says it's not good for me, then I don't read it.
And Paro, when you are writing your books and when you're also working with your your literature and action program, have you ever been surprised by the age of the reader who comes up to you and talks about your book and you thought that maybe
yes,
that person is too young?
It just happened a couple of months ago in Bangalore, where I was talking about The Other, which is definitely teenager, young adult. And there were some very young students who came, and I said to the organizers, I don't think they should be here in this session. And so the organizer was asking them to leave. They said, but why? We've read the book. So I was really surprised. But when I talked to them, they had some very interesting points. These were class 4. That means they'd be 10, 8, 9-year-olds. And they said, there should be more Me Too movements, not only for sexual harassment, but also for something like bullying. There should be a Me Too movement for bullying. And I was really surprised that I have also had 2-year-olds spending their first week in school, and I used the word diet, and I thought, oh, they won't know what that is. But when I asked them, they said, yes, it's when mummies stop eating food because fat mummies look very funny. So, but only mummies were dieting apparently.
Yes, it's quite surprising how informed children are. I mean, I'll give you an example of a conversation between 2 7-year-olds. So one of them asks the other 2 little girls, what's lesbian? So, what's lesbian? So this other child replies, it's when 2 women kiss each other on the lips and love each other. I thought that was an amazing explanation. And, very compassionate and very understanding, which a lot of adults don't have. So I really feel that as children's writers, we should not be afraid to introduce serious themes and serious questions to children, because they can actually cope much better than we think.
I also want to raise this question of that as children's writers, we are presenting certain childhoods to the world. There are certain assumptions around childhood as well as certain experiences of childhood that we are presenting in our stories to the world, because those are the experiences that either we have lived or we are familiar with, but it's actually leaving out so many childhoods in the country of working children, of migrant children, of children from tribal backgrounds. And their lives simply don't find representation in a lot of children's stories. So as children's authors, do you ever sort of think about your ambit having to include so many new readers who are not actually finding themselves in the books? Yeah.
I actually, in the project that I worked on, which was the world's longest newspaper, where we were giving voice to children who had never had a platform to express their own opinions, I was astonished by the stories that they wrote, which were powerful and positive and extremely well-informed, and these were children in difficult circumstances. So whether they were children impacted by terrorism in Kashmir, or tribal children, or like in Gadchiroli, children really impacted by the Nakshal movement there and all of that. So this then went on to become so political platform where children were talking about their politics, the politics of childhood in these circumstances. And it was an incredible thing. I wish it could be an ongoing project. It isn't anymore. But also that because I work a lot with children in difficult circumstances, a lot of my writing is in their voice. At the moment, I'm writing a book called Nomad's Land, which is about displacement and losing home.
So, there is this colleague of mine who always tells us this story, and it never fails to move me, where he went to a school in a poor area, and he was supposed to interact with the teachers and the students to figure out the quality of education. And he asked all the children to come out into the sports field, and he said, let's all stand in a circle and hold hands, and we'll do some activities. And when that happened, there was a boy who wouldn't hold hands with the others. And he went to the nearest tree and broke 2 branches, and he held branches in either of his hands because he knew that the other children would not touch him. And he just stood there with the branches, and I mean, my colleague says he was so shocked that he forgot the activity that he had wanted to do with the children, because he had never ever thought that he would have to confront a situation where this child was so shunned in school that nobody would touch him even in a game. So I mean, that child's experience of childhood and education and coming to school is not something that we will actually find in our mainstream languages and stories. So, with that thought, I will now open up the floor to questions. And you can ask questions, and we can take 2 or 3, and you can tell us whom you want to answer.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm just wondering what you have to say about the place of innocence in this screen-rich time with all the issues that you've been talking about.
Sorry,
what's the place of innocence in your writings?
Innocence?
Innocence in this screen-rich time where children are exposed to so many issues these days.
All the authors? Innocence? Innocence?
Well, can I?
Sure.
Yeah. Sure. You said innocence, right? Like children are innocent. I think one of the reasons why I write children books, or at least books who are put in the children's shelves in the bookstores, is that I am really fascinated by the innocence in children. And also, all of my novels for adults are very much about children. I write about the relationship between parents and children, and I also have very important characters in my adult novels who are children. And I think, and I've been thinking about that a lot, why do I always write about children? And I think it's because they are innocent. And vulnerable, and of course because I have 3 children, and I really do worry about the future for them. But I think this vulnerability and the innocence is something I continue to think about all the time, and for me it's the most, it's sort of the emotional core of all my writing, actually.
There's a wonderful quote, which is, do you prepare the path for the child or the child for the path? And yes, innocence is to be treasured and protected, but the vulnerability of childhood also needs to be protected. And so I really do believe that you have to prepare the child for the path, because you can only prepare the path that much and no more.
I would be a little devil's advocate here when we talk of innocence about children, but at the same time, do you ever think that they can be more brutal than adults? When in school they bully someone, they really don't know that what it means to be, how other child is affected by that, whereas that adult knows what I am doing with when I am bullying something or giving pain to someone. So children are not always that innocent as we always feel. So I wanted to put this contrarian view. And second thing is on like Ramayana, Mahabharata or Shri Krishna that you, Rohini, had said. My view is, why do we want to put a value judgment on the texts that were texts of their time? There were certain other values at that time, and if we pass judgment on that, whether it's right or wrong, because today it may be wrong and probably few generations after the same thing maybe look right.
If I can answer your question about value judgment on stories of the past, as you call them. When I work with things like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, or from the Western world, even great epics like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the main characteristic of these stories is that they have survived millennia. They have come down to us through the ages. And there is something very universal about their content. So for instance, if you take the Ramayana, let me talk about the Ramayana since I'm working with it and I'm most familiar with it. The point of these stories is not to pass judgment. Nobody is passing any kind of judgment. But they do open up questions for discussion. For instance, Sita, who is she? Is she a submissive wife? Is she a free-thinking woman? Who is she? We don't know. The situation is put forward, and the readers and those who tell the story, those who read it, those who listen to it, are invited to talk about it. So, I mean, there are events in the Ramayana, for instance, where the hero Ram is questioned by many people. They say, well, what he did was not right, what he did was not honest. Whereas those who are very devout will say, no, it's God's ways, and so whatever he does is right. The point, in my opinion, is not to pass judgment, not to say, yes, he was right, yes, he was wrong, yes, this is valid for our times, yes, this is not. These are points of debate. This is where you open up conversations. This is where you make the reader and the listener and the teller think. I think that's the point of these stories, and that's why they survive.
I think it's also important to remember there are so many versions of the Ramayana, depending on who's telling it and where.
Hello, ma'am. I just want to ask that right now we discussed about, covered a lot of topic about how to bring adult content or content things that are issues that are relevant to adults into children's novels, how to filter them and all those things. What I want to ask is, how do we go about searching for issues that children themselves are very much bothered about? For example, bullying, like you said, like that is not mostly covered. Like we need a Me Too movement for bullying also. So such issues that children are actually thinking about, things that are very trivial for us, but for them they may be very important. How do we figure out them? How do we find them as writers?
Well, I work with children.
Yeah.
About 50% of my time is with children, so their concerns and issues, I familiarize myself with those, with them.
And we do have to remember that children are living in a world which is largely constructed and controlled by adults. So it's not like we are entirely unaware of, the kind of issues that they are facing, whether in school or at home. We instinctively have a sense of that.
As parents, for instance, we see children around us, and then I personally, as a children's writer, I find it very useful to interact with children, to just talk to them and converse with them. And yes, a large part of it is, as Manisha says, they're not living in a different world. But also, I agree with a bit of what you're saying, that sometimes we do not see their perspective unless we are in contact with them. So as a children's writer, for me, it's very important to be in touch with children. Otherwise, I feel I'm not getting across.
No, and I think somebody like Anushka should also maybe put in a word.
Yes.
How, I mean, do you write about things that you really feel are important?
Yes. Well,
I mean, why do you write why do you choose what you're writing? Is it because you're interested in that, or is it something happening in school? What might prompt you to write about something?
when I feel like writing, if my mind goes blank, if I don't have any ideas, I look around. If looking around does not help, if something does not catch my eye, something that I want to write about, I think about how my day went. If there's something that happened with me or something that I was thinking about during my school or when at home, I think about it and then I decide whether to write about it or not. Otherwise, some days go bad in terms of writing. When there's writer's block, I cannot think of anything. When I try to write something, it does not come out really nice. But then there are also days when I write 2-3 poems at a stretch, or maybe a short story, or maybe a paragraph on some specific topic, and that goes really nice. Then sometimes I try to write about things in depth. Sometimes I write about funny topics, or maybe sometimes even sad. But then sometimes I try to write about societal truths or something like that. It's a bit difficult right now because I don't really know much about it, but I've read quotes. I like reading quotes, and sometimes I take up a specific quote and I try to frame something around it. I try to write a poem around it, or maybe a paragraph around it, or an essay, and that's how I choose what I want to write about.
I think she's a great example of preparing a path and she can walk. Yeah. I mean, you sort of create an environment where she can do what she likes.
Can I add something? I just want to say that for me at least, writing is not, it's not a process of deliberate choices. It sometimes feels like the story is just happening and I have to live through it. And I also, when I write, I never think about the readers. I just write and try to be true to the story and true to my character and try to live his or her life, as you said. So it's not like I research for the Snow Sister. I didn't look around for a theme. I was just thinking about this boy, and I knew he was sad from the beginning, and I started to question why he was sad, and then I realized his sister had passed away. So it feels more organic. And it sometimes feels like magic because the story just happens.
I think we are out of time. I can see on the monitor we are completely out of time. Any other questions? Over tea outside. Thanks.